All right, welcome to the Week 15 Forum. As I mentioned in the weekly overview, the article we're going to be discussing strikes me as a good summary piece on what is going on with American intergovernmental relations. And again, it's by Timothy Conlon. It's from, I think, last year's edition of State and Local Government Review. So if you can see that, there we go. And again, the article is called The Changing Politics of American Federalism. Conlon begins with an important observation that the academics of the 1950s and 60s did a very good job of capturing what had been the norms of American politics from the late 19th to the mid-century. We had a highly decentralized system with very strong politics at the state level, and that national politics was generally a coalition affair. What they didn't see was that policy changes especially in the 40s and in that wave in the 1960s, were creating enormous changes in the political system that was having an effect on the basic structure of our government. The first broad trend that Conlon notes is that national politics was percolating down into the state and local level. That is partially a byproduct of the fact that policymaking at the national level was increasingly national in scope, and increasingly the national parties were plowing money into strengthening the state parties. The result, as Conlon put it, was kind of a reversal of the power relationship between the national and the state parties. The national party was increasingly the more powerful party, or the more powerful actor. These changes were clearly helped along by the kind of aggressive national policies pursued during the New Deal and what we might call the Great Society eras that Robertson talks about in the text that we used. Conlon notes that while the states had retained and perhaps even enhanced their status as laboratories of democracy, Congress was much more quickly and comprehensively applying those innovations at the state level nationally. So what are the consequences of nationalization for American politics? The second trend that Conlon discusses is the increasingly polarized nature of American politics. What are some of the indicators that Conlon points out as evidence of a rising polarization in American politics? How is that polarization reflected in policymaking? One thing that Conlon writes about is the idea of leapfrog representation, where the increasing partisanship leads parties to spend time and political capital reversing the policy accomplishments of the other party when they were in the majority. As an illustration, Ted Cruz ran for the Senate in 2012 and ultimately for president in 2016, promising to repeal every word of the Affordable Care Act, which was the signal achievement of Barack Obama. Likewise, what do you think that is the likelihood that if Donald Trump succeeded in his pledge as a candidate to build a wall along the border between the United States and Mexico, that every Democratic president in 2020 would include a pledge to tear down that wall, and that every Democratic president in 24, in 28, in 32 would likewise be making the same pledge for the same reasons, because it enhances their attractiveness with an increasingly influential bloc of voters. So can you see how partisan polarization is driving candidates to make these kinds of promises, which is in turn just further polarizing our politics? We don't have norms that basically say, okay, the other side won, we're going to allow this policy to stay in place. We just don't do that unless it's going to hurt us. And in fact, I would argue that Republicans did get hurt in these midterm elections. I think the Arizona race ultimately boiled down to the fact that Sinema supported the Affordable Care Act and McSally voted to get rid of it. One of the interesting takeaways from this section is how partisan polarization has reduced the effectiveness of the intergovernmental lobby. There was a time when the National Governors Association and the U.S. Conference of Mayors were some of the most effective lobbying organizations in Washington, D.C. Conlon mentions the success of the National Governors Association in getting Congress to pass general revenue sharing, which is an issue that it's a period, 1972 to 1986, that we really haven't talked about much in class, So I'm going to briefly talk about it a little bit here, and if you have any additional questions, we can go into more detail in the forum. General revenue sharing should be thought of as an extension of Nixon's idea surrounding new federalism. From a tactical perspective, he wanted to shift money away from fighting the war on poverty, which most Republicans viewed as basically lavishing money on inner city minorities who didn't vote for Republicans, and sending that money directly to the states with even fewer strings attached than you would have with block grants. So in fact, general revenue sharing was considered earlier in the Johnson administration as a way of getting around all the congressional wrangling that inevitably took place during the appropriations process when you were fighting over all these New Deal and Great Society era programs. Okay, so needless to say, general revenue sharing, when it was put in place in 1972, was wildly popular on a bipartisan basis at the state and local level. It significantly increased the available revenues at the state level. And they didn't really have to take the risk of raising taxes to get the money. So nevertheless, general revenue sharing was killed by the Reagan administration in 1986. Why do you think that was? It was a very popular program, certainly at the state and local level. Who do you think that it was unpopular with? We can talk about that in the forum. The last issue that Conlin addresses is this notion of delegitimation. What does Conlin mean by delegitimization or delegitimation? How does Conlin go about measuring the degrees to which Americans' collective dissatisfaction with the federal government has reached proportions significant enough to raise questions about the legitimacy of our constitutional system? Conlin also notes that although Americans don't like the federal government, they're a lot better disposed towards both state and local governments, which is interesting to me, both because state and local governments are much more subject to capture by powerful state and local economic interests. So perhaps from that we can read that Americans like their government to be the best government money can buy. But also the rates of participation are much lower for the state and especially for the local governments. So what explains this disjuncture? So one result of the unpopularity of the federal government, again, this is something that I think that Conlin brings out that maybe hasn't been brought more fully to the fore in our, throughout the course of the semester, is that the federal government increasingly finds itself relying on more and more indirect governance, where the federal government may mandate an action or create a program, but not directly administer it. Conlin argues that paradoxically, this kind of indirect governance has the effect of further deepening mistrust in the federal government. That really creates a dilemma, right? What can federal elected officials do to improve trust in the federal government? How do you reverse this decades-long erosion in the trust of, in government? So hopefully I've given you plenty to think about and discuss. Remember, if you have a question or if something is confusing to you, don't hesitate to throw out a question, and I'll try to get to it if I have a chance to read it, or hopefully one of your fellow discussants will kind of help you along the way. So let's learn a lot this week.